So it's the right, that's a right for the patient to get the records. So we call when the doctors don't want to, keep on telling us that, that they will send it next week, and nothing happens. We just, we sometimes send letters with the, what's the name when you send a letter and they have to sign when they receive this?
Receipt acknowledgement?
Yeah, so one of these letters, so that means that they sign and receive they acknowledge that they received the letter.
That's right.
So that make them more obligated to send it because it's the patient right to receive.
That's right.
The records.
That's right.
So there are many ways to get.
But in cases where the sponsor does not require records prior to randomization, some studies they're okay with a verbal report. Other studies, they're okay with the assessments that are done at the site to see if the patient qualifies. But other times they absolutely insist, and then there's nothing you can do as a site except trying to obtain those records. Sometimes the patients need to ask for them.
Yeah.
Right? Oftentimes the easiest thing is for the patient to go into their office, the doctor office, and ask for their own records.
Yes, that's true. But sometimes even the PI don't diagnose, but confirms the patient has this condition.
Right. Right. Okay, so patient stipend. Okay, most studies offer some form of compensation. Sponsor or CRO may require proof of subject payment. Usually they don't because they know sites are not going to not want to pay their patients. Okay, what sites pay the patient is nothing compared to what the site makes from that visit. So of course they want to keep the patients happy. The sponsors are not worried about sites not paying the patients. Okay, but sometimes they require proof of the subject payments. Remember, SOP. Sometimes it's the CRO SOP to check. Sometimes it's the sponsor SOP to check. So keep a log for each patient and have them sign each time they receive the payment. Most CROs do not require proof of patient payment, like I said. And if your employer requires proof, make sure the subject is being paid as outlined in the informed consent and use whatever means your employer chooses for tracking. So sometimes your site director will want proof based on your SOPs.
And that's good clinical practice to keep the record of that. And in the case your site ever gets audited by the FDA, you have all the records of absolutely everything, including this.
I've seen all forms of payment: cash, check, prepaid debit card. If in the case of prepaid debit card, the sponsor provides the system for the site to refill.
One of the systems is Clin Card.
Clin Card, and then Greenfire. Those are some of the vendors. Those are the debit cards the site can refill each time a patient comes in. I don't think it's necessary for a site to purchase this, especially if you're a small site. I don't think it's necessary. Usually sponsors will pay for this if they want that used. If you're a small site, cash or check is fine, unless the sponsor is paying for the vendor. And usually the patients, they don't always want that refillable card.
No, I noticed that they don't like it.
Yeah, they don't like it. Sometimes you get charged a fee for using it. So, they prefer cash or check. So just check with your SOPs and the sponsor for this. All right, what do we have here? We have example. We were talking about source this entire time. Next slides are some examples of source.
Yep.
Okay. This is a screening visit. How do I know? Because it says informed consent. That's how I know. And it says visit screening on the top. I just saw that now. That's a good giveaway. This is what a typical source document looks like. Remember, this could be electronic. If it's electronic, it looks the same way, except you, instead of writing on it with ink, you type in it, like you type in on a mobile device or on a laptop.
Yeah, and depending on the state that you are, sometimes there are some documents that are obligatory.
Yeah, like the California Bill of Rights is a perfect example. Okay, that's in California. For research, patients need to be given the California Bill of Rights. check with your state and local regulations. Okay, I don't know which other states have the Bill of Rights, but you got to check. You just Google. Okay.
So it's mandatory. So make sure that every time you give the patient informed consent, with it you give the patient the California Bill of Rights and HIPAA. Always HIPAA is for the whole country.
That's right.
And sometimes some studies are required to do something called UBAC, which is like a.
That's right. Explain what that is. UBACC, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's like a test that you do to the patient after the patient has written the inform of consent. So after the patient reads the inform of consent, you give this patient this UBAC. It's a test. So that's to make sure the patient understood what they was reading.
That's right.
They were reading, or they actually read it, because sometimes the patients don't read it and they just go and sign it. And you don't want that. You want the patient to know what they are getting into.
And something here, which I will look if this is a screening, I will look and see, but it's the process of consent. Okay, it needs to be explained. Anytime an informed consent form is presented, the process, a detailed process, who conducted the informed consent with the patient, which staff member, okay, what did the patient ask, what was discussed, what amendment was it, okay, what version was it. These are things that need to go in a process of consent. This is most likely going to be in your SOP. Some sites SOP require the UBEC, like you said. Other times sponsors require that. Okay, and that's a quiz designed to see if the patients understand what they're getting into. Even if that's not required, you should document in your process of consent that the patient understands. You literally write it, okay, or if it's an electronic source, you type it out, like in sentences.
Or you can do a note to file.
Or a note to file.
Yeah.
On this visit, 11/26/19, patient came in to screen Monica Quitiva, the CRC, conducted the informed consent with the patient. The patient was made aware of all risks, benefits, and potential side effects of being in the study. Patient understands that it is voluntary to be in the study. Patient understands that they're able to withdraw at any time. Patient asked a question, and this is where you can enter whatever the patient asked. Okay? Or patient had no questions. You write that. Patient was given a copy of the consent to take home.
Yes.
Right?
That's a must.
That's a must. So this is an example of process of consent. It doesn't have to be long, but a paragraph or two should be there. I've seen some sites have checklists for process of consent.
Yeah. Actually, in the study aids that we have in this for this class, you guys have a sample of SOPs with the form of consent, so check it out.
I like this, Monica. Very good. Okay, so checklist, see? And then demographics. Now we get into the actual study, okay? Date of birth, gender, ethnicity. This is all self-explanatory, but this is what, for this particular study, what's required for the site to capture, okay? So this is where it gets tricky, because this medical history is where you need to rely on previous documentation, okay? Or if you don't have that, you're relying on the patient's verbal report or a physician's verbal report, okay? I've seen that before, where I'm requesting medical records from the patient's physician and they're just taking long to get it back to me. So I just call the office and I ask them, hey, here's the HIPAA, I just fax it to you, I'm waiting for your records, but in the meantime, because I need to randomize this patient, can you confirm that they have diabetes? Or can you confirm they have schizophrenia? And then you write down, I discussed with this person on this date that they have this. We're pending receipt of records. That's source, okay? This is where you put all these things, the body systems and then the conditions.
And everything that is in this source document is because it was on the protocol that requests all this information.
That's right. And the EDC?
Mm-hmm.
The EDC will have this too. Okay, and then the status of the medical history. Is it ongoing? Is it unstable? Is it stable? Is it resolved? Right? When they're screening, if it's unstable, chances are it's going to be an exclusion.
Yes.
Okay? If it's resolved and it's screening, you're not going to put it on there because it's resolved. They don't have it. Okay, if it's stable, you're going to put it there.
Unless the protocol requires that certain condition, that the patient didn't have this condition within the past 2 years.
This is correct.
So, or if they want the medical history for the past 2 years. So then even if it's resolved, then you're going to put it, but it was resolved like a year ago.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
This is very true. Okay, usually these are just checked as stable at screening. Okay, and then maybe they resolve during the study, but it's rare that these things resolve unless there's something that's like acute and not chronic.
Mm-hmm.
Chronic things usually don't resolve. Okay, physical exam. This is where somebody's got to do this. A clinician. This person needs to be on the delegation log. Who's doing the physical exam? Usually it has to be an MD, a nurse practitioner. Usually it can't be a coordinator unless they are an MD, DO, NP, RN.
Exactly.
Right? This is important. This person has to do, and they have to be on the delegation log and do this physical exam. Okay? Normal, abnormal. Is it clinically significant? Is it not clinically significant? Was it not done? Sometimes patients refuse certain procedures. Okay?
Yeah.
And if the PI thinks it's not necessary, they write why, but they have to check with the sponsor because sometimes sponsors require everything to be done.
A physician assistant is able, right? I mean, in California.
Yeah, you got to check with the state, but yeah, for the most part, physician assistants are allowed. That's correct.
Okay.
And then every sponsor is different. Sometimes a nurse is allowed, okay, in California or any state, but the sponsor says no, we need an MD to do this. So it just depends. You gotta check with the sponsor, okay? And this is one of the things that the monitor should be checking at the SIV. They're gonna look at the delegation log and say, who's doing the physical exams? Does the sponsor approve this person? Not only that, they collect a copy of the delegation log.
Yeah. And
So the sponsor needs to review that.
And sometimes they ask you to do like a physical exam, like a generic one, but sometimes they request specific things. So you have to put it in the physical examination.
Very true. Very true. Okay, CONMEDs. Okay. Concomitant medications. Any medications the patient is taking in addition to the IP before and during the study.
Even if it's like vitamins or herbs.
That's right. Now let's say you screen someone today, November 26th, okay? They come in today. They told you, I was taking vitamin C my whole life, but I stopped last week. Okay? Well, you don't enter that in the CONMED. Anything the patient is taking and continues to take
anything that
after
is
screening.
current.
Correct. Anything. It could be supplements. It could be, literally anything. You're supposed to document all of it. Over the counter, prescription, it doesn't matter.
I'm thinking this, for example, if they in the protocol says that they will accept any patient that is, they have that condition and blah blah blah, and is not taking any of the prohibited medications, but they don't want a patient that was taking, for example, aspirin in the last 3 months. So if the patient stopped the week before, then that patient is not. Is
very good. Very good. So if they are, so you need to ask, and when the IE criteria comes up in the source, which it should at screening and at baseline, randomization visit, that will be in there, and you have to, in those cases, you have to check. So very good example, Monica.
Yeah, so always, that's why it's so important to read the whole protocol, because then you will know what to look for and what to put in the source document, because you can put a footnote here for the concomitant medication, Like if the patient took aspirin in the last 3 months, that's exclusionary. So maybe the patient will have to wait 2 more months or 2 months and a half more or 3 months to
That's
actually
right.
get into the, a screen.
That's right. That's right. The next section is adverse events. Okay, so any untoward medical occurrence, okay, that's an adverse event that occurs to the subject that is not part of medical history unless it's an exacerbation of the medical history, meaning the medical history condition got worse. So from the moment they sign the consent form, you're tracking every adverse event, anything, headache, stomach ache, increase of their depression symptoms if they have been diagnosed, or if depression is part of their medical history, if anxiety is part of their medical history and they're reporting an increase in anxiety, that's an AE. From the minute they sign the consent form, you're tracking AE. Now, you're always checking, okay, is this medical history or is this AE? But if it's an exacerbation of the medical history condition, it's an AE, and only the PI can determine this.
Yeah, even if the patient has not yet taken any IP, if the patient says, "Oh, I start having headache," right after the patient did, sign off the ICF, then you have to report it.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Or if the patient signs the consent form and then sprains their finger,
yeah,
while they're doing it, that's AE. Okay. ECG. Now, if the patient has arthritis, okay, has medical history, and is complaining of pain when they are signing the consent form, the PI will determine, okay, is this an AE or is this part of medical history?
Yeah.
So you gotta use common sense, but it's only the PI can do this, not the coordinator.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you're not a clinician. Even if you are, it's not your study. It's the PI study.
Exactly.
Okay. So ECG, okay. Notice how it says ECG completed before vitals and blood draw. That's because in this case, in this study, that's what the protocol said. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Okay? But look at the detail, okay? The protocol said ECG must be done before vitals and blood draw. So in the source, it has it there.
Yeah.
Before. This way you don't make mistakes. Otherwise, if that wasn't there, and a coordinator's doing this, and maybe they, forgot that part of the protocol, well, they may do the vitals first because it was easier that day. Maybe the ECG was being used by someone else, and to save time, they did the vitals first, and then they did ECG. Well, that's deviation, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And since that box is there, it's emphasizing it. So this is where an example, perfect example of source either saving you from a disaster in the study or helping you.
Yeah.
This is why Monica's assigning this homework for you.
Yeah, it's so important, and it's actually kind of interesting because then you get familiarized with this.
That's right.
process.
So pay attention to that. And then as soon as you get the results, normal, abnormal, NCS, staff initials who did it, okay? Only the PI can assess ECG results and lab results. Vital signs next. Okay, look again. For this particular protocol, they have certain things with the blood pressure that they consider out of range. But as a good clinical practice, you should look for these things anyways, okay? Systolic BP.